Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Boris Johnson has become something of a hate figure to a chunk of liberal Britain who blame him for what they see as the Brexit catastrophe. They think he lied in the referendum campaign and persuaded Britain to self-harm, all to serve his own political career. Well, Mr Johnson is bravely trying to appeal to those core Remainers tomorrow. His is the first in a series of speeches on Brexit by cabinet ministers over the next few days. And he'll argue Brexit is basically a liberal project. It's about pulling down barriers, not erecting them. So he means it's liberal in the sense of free trade. Well, apart from trying to heal Brexit division, good luck with that, it's an attempt to reclaim Brexit from any suggestion it's all about Nigel Farage. So does the Foreign Secretary's argument fly? Certainly there is a lot of illiberalism on the continent, but Mr Johnson's problem is there's a lot of illiberalism here too, much of it on his Brexit supporting side. So what is he trying to do? Our political editor Nick Watt reports.
We are, it would seem, a divided country. In the 20 months since the Brexit referendum, the two sides seem as divided as ever. But have no fear, help is at hand. The man who transformed the Leave cause is reaching out across the divide. Boris Johnson will criticise some ardent pro-Europeans who he will accuse of trying to reverse Brexit. But I'm told that he's also expected to put balm on the wounds caused by the bitter referendum campaign. This may all seem a far cry from his joshing of the Remain camp just a few months ago.
Every day, a distinguished pink newspaper manages to make Eeyore look positively exuberant.
Just under a year ago, you wouldn't have known there was a divide that needed to be healed.
This year, after a period of intense debate over the right future for our country, there is a sense that people are coming together and uniting behind the opportunities that lie ahead.
Boris Johnson now feels it's time for something of a reset of the optics around Brexit. I understand he's told his inner circle that he wants to rescue Brexit from what he privately calls the Farageist worldview, inward and backward looking. As passionate as ever about the opportunities that will be provided by leaving the European Union, he believes you can support Brexit whilst being an internationalist, a globalist and a liberal, the values he says he shares with many Remain supporters.
Well, I'm all in favour of reaching out. I think quite a lot of people voted Remain out of fear for the short-term economic consequences, and it's great news that the forecasts were wrong and that the economy has continued to grow and we've got more jobs and house prices didn't tank and so forth. So there will be some of those who say, well, maybe it wasn't quite as bad as we thought. And we want this to work for everybody. Those of us who believe in it believe that Britain will be more prosperous and more free when it is a self-governing country again.
A leading pro-European Tory is not changing her view about Brexit and is sceptical of the Foreign Secretary's claim that it is a liberal cause.
Liberal doesn't mean anything. If it means free trade, we've got free trade. We are about to throw away umpteen free trade deals. We've got frictionless trade. But if liberal means doing exactly what we want and hoping everyone else will let us, then I don't think that world exists. Is hiding all the vital information we need to know about what the impact of what we're doing might be liberal? I don't think so. Is putting up new trade barriers where currently none exist liberal? I don't think so. What does this mean? If we are trying to make our own rules, make our own laws, and expect that everyone else will respect our laws, but we don't really have to comply with theirs, then that's not how the world works.
A pollster wonders whether Boris Johnson is the right messenger.
After being very much the Heineken mayor of London, reaching the parts that other politicians cannot reach, Boris Johnson may well regard himself as the best person on the Leave side to appeal to Remainers. And indeed, if he can't do it, then perhaps nobody can. But what he may find is that he's not Heineken, he's Marmite. And for Remainers, that means a lot of people see him simply as a Leaver and they don't like it.
So Boris Johnson will cast himself as the nation's healer. With divisions in his own family, he knows he faces a monumental challenge. But in the end, he believes a free spirit unleashed by Brexit will prevail.
Nick, what there? Well, we're now joined by two men, both consider themselves Liberal in their own way. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Vince Cable, and the Conservative MEP, Dan Hannan, who's in Brussels this evening. Very good evening to you both. Sir Vince, Boris as healer, Boris Johnson as healer. Do you feel healed? Do you warm to him and his message?
Well, the rhetoric's friendly, and we know he can be charming and witty, but actually the substance is not helpful. I mean, what I can't understand is this use of the word liberal. I mean, it's either a deliberate misuse of language or intellectual confusion. I mean, the heart of the European project, which he wants us to disengage from, and it's one of the government's red lines, is the single market. The single market is fundamentally a liberal idea. It's about freeing up trade in goods, freeing up trade in services, freeing up capital movements, freeing up labour movements. A liberal idea. Yet the whole point about what the government's trying to achieve, and particularly the hardliners like Boris Johnson, the Chancellor's in a slightly different position, is actually getting us out of that liberal arrangement and creating additional barriers to trade as a consequence. And in addition to that, of course, the other red line is about withdrawing from the customs union. Even if you manage to negotiate a tariff-free agreement, you would have friction at the borders because you have to check for these so-called
it's about
rules of
creating
origin.
barriers, not
It's
removing
about
them.
creating
And Dan Hannan, that is the paradox of what Boris Johnson is arguing this evening, that you've got the most liberal trading deal in the whole world, basically, the EU, and then you're leaving it. So deal with that paradox, if you would.
Well, obviously, I don't see it that way. I see the EU as a top-down anti-regist project, and there has been a general global liberalisation, economic liberalisation, trade liberalisation, which is a good thing, has been a great vehicle for poverty alleviation. But the European Union hasn't been at the forefront of it. And I think being an internationalist and liberal leaver is about raising our eyes to more distant horizons. I mean, since 2010, Britain's exports to the EU have grown by 10%. Our exports to the US or to New Zealand have grown by 40% each, to China and Japan by 60%, to South Korea by 100%. So the idea that somehow by remaining in a tariff-walled and often protectionist EU, we are necessarily advancing the liberal project, I just don't agree with. And I think there's another thing here, which is important for a foreign secretary to be stressing. You know, a lot of overseas observers and overseas media only see the Faragist, as you put it, argument for Brexit. They've got this kind of bizarre idea that the only possible reason to have voted Leave was out of nostalgia or bigotry or dislike of immigrants. I think it's actually the duty of a British Foreign Secretary to make the case that we are an engaged country, interested and involved in the affairs of every continent, including Europe.
You've said a lot there. I just want to go back to this issue around trade, because it's very abstract talking about liberal this and global Britain that. Can you give me a concrete way in which we will be more liberal as a result of leaving? So I just want to know what this actually means in practice, not this kind of, you know, we know what it means in abstract. What does it mean in practice, being more liberal?
Well, the EU applies a lot of barriers, particularly non-tariff barriers, to some of the poorest countries in the world, especially in the field of agriculture.
So we will remove those barriers. Just to be sorry to interrupt. Is it your contention we will remove those barriers and have more imports of cheap agricultural products from poorer countries?
So that prices in the UK fall, which will benefit all of us, but will especially benefit the people on the lowest incomes who spend a higher proportion of their weekly budgets on the necessities like food, footwear, and clothing.
You've given us a good one there. Vince Cable, in that sense, you're not going to argue the CAP is a liberal project. The single market you can get away with.
But it is not a liberal project.
But do you see that there are things, you know, you can say, well, look, it works both ways. OK, single market, you call it liberal, but then we'll be more liberal in agriculture if we leave?
Well, there are a few barriers to developing countries, and he's quite right. But actually, compared with, say, 20 years ago, the European Union is a much more open economy than the United States, than Japan, China, and other trading. Britain, the European Union has actually led the way to opening up world trade through the World Trade Organization. Of course, there are barriers that remain. What I'm not clear about is what the Brexiteers want to do about it. I mean, one of the things you could do is to simply say we're going to throw open our market, get rid of all our trade barriers and just enjoy that freedom. That is a liberal argument, an economically liberal argument, but actually that's not what Theresa May is doing. I mean, she's charging around the world, signing in a rather pathetic way, trying to get the Chinese and the Indians and so sign bilateral agreements, which of course fragment the trading system even more. That's not a liberal way to approach trade.
Daniel Hannan, do you think the British people who voted for Brexit thought they were voting for more cheap imports from poorer countries, for more globalisation, for more free trade, perhaps for more immigration from India and other parts of Asia or Africa when they voted for Brexit? Because actually that is part of your contention.
17.4 million people who voted leave. So obviously there was a broad range of motives, and I can't tell you what every single one of those people was saying. But yeah, plainly there were liberal leavers. Every free market libertarian I know was a Leave voter. What I think is important here is to get away from this caricature of Leave as being a basically backward-looking project. I mean, I remember on the day after the referendum coming on this programme and talking to you, Evan, and saying, voting Leave doesn't mean there's going to be zero immigration. There'll still be immigration, but it'll be subject to democratic control. And you pulled your face into a kind of Paxman-esque leer of incredulity and mimed banging your head against the table. But I'd been saying the same thing throughout the campaign, as had Boris. I think there was some selective turning of a deaf ear to what we were saying.
It's a very strange thing that if it was such a liberal project, that immigration control featured so heavily as the way to try and sell it to the British people. More globalisation was not the slogan.
At the main debate, the most watched, the Great Wembley debate, I remember Boris beginning by saying, I'm not only liberal on immigration, I actually have favoured giving an amnesty to migrants already here. So this is not something he tried to slip out in the small print. And I think a slightly grotesque caricature, a cartoonish version, has been built up since the vote, not least in overseas media, and I think it's quite important that the British Foreign Secretary should be reminding our friends and allies around the world that we remain an engaged and trusted global partner.
Do you buy that argument, Vince Cable?
Mr. Hannan is in a minority of one amongst the Brexiteers arguing for more liberal immigration policy. The government makes it clear day after day after day in Parliament that they want to restrict immigration more severely. I mean, you can make a theoretical, economically liberal argument for saying let's have less regulation of the environment and labour standards and animal rights, but actually that's not what the government's about. They're arguing the exact opposite. They come to Parliament and they promise that none of these regulations will be removed. Indeed, they may be improved. So there's a fundamental dishonesty in this use of the word liberal.
Daniel Hannan, Sir Vince Cable, thank you both very much indeed.